All right, let's just jump right in. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to neatly and neutrally deconstruct a topic that is highly complex and honestly incredibly deep-rooted. We are talking about the Alberta separatist movement. Now, to do this, we'll be looking at a recent presentation by a prominent voice in this space, Kathy Flett, to figure out exactly what arguments and frustrations are actually fueling this push. Just to be super clear right up front, our goal here isn't to take sides. We're just going to map out the source material and see how these arguments are built from the ground up. Because honestly, whether you live out west or out east, understanding this perspective is absolutely crucial to grasping today's political landscape. To really get this, we have to anchor the presentation with this quite literal blast from the past. Look at this quote from Frank Oliver. This is from 1885. It fascinatingly illustrates that Western alienation, it's not some modern internet trend or a recent political talking point. It is a century-old grievance. People were literally complaining about a lack of local control before Alberta was even officially a province. So to unpack all of this, we're going to follow a 5-part grievance roadmap. We'll hit the roots of alienation, the imbalance of power, economic grievances, social and injustice concerns, and ultimately, the push for separation. Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the roots of alienation, and specifically how the map was drawn. If we look at the historical timeline, the speaker points out those early grumblings happening as far back as 1885. By 1904, local leaders actually proposed creating one massive jurisdiction called the Province of Buffalo. But, according to the source, Ottawa flat out rejected this. Why? Because they feared a single, giant Western province would totally shift the balance of power. So instead, in 1905, Ottawa just went ahead and drew the lines themselves, splitting the territory into Alberta and Saskatchewan. And this, right here, is the speaker's core historical grievance. Think about it like this. If you contrast how different provinces joined Canada, the source points out that places like Nova Scotia, BC, and Newfoundland actually got to sit at a table and negotiate their entry into Confederation. But Alberta and Saskatchewan, they experienced an imposed creation. The argument is that they were essentially colonized. Their borders and even their very first leaders were dictated by Ottawa, meaning they never really had a seat at the table from day one. Which brings us right into Section 2, the imbalance of power. Are we really seeing representation by population? Let's crunch some numbers, because the math here is wild. Down in Prince Edward Island, you've got roughly 45,000 citizens for every senator and every member of parliament. But jump over to Alberta, and those numbers explode to a staggering 815,000 citizens per senator and about 132,000 per MP. The speaker uses this exact data to argue that mathematically, an Albertan's vote simply does not carry anywhere near the same weight as an Eastern voter's. Now, you might be wondering, how does a discrepancy like that even happen? Well, the presentation points straight to the senatorial clause. Basically, it's a constitutional rule stating a province can never have fewer MPs than it has senators. And because Senate seats are permanently locked in, certain eastern provinces maintain this fixed baseline of political power, completely regardless of whether their populations shrink or grow over time. To really drive home what this power imbalance feels like on the ground, the speaker cites a very specific and frankly striking frustration. 8:06 p.m. That was the exact time a recent federal election winner was called by the media. The catch? The polls out west hadn't even closed yet. For the speaker, this is literal proof that Western votes, mathematically, just don't matter to the final outcome of federal elections. So that raises a pretty fascinating question for us. Is this entire movement driven just by a lack of political seats and some century-old borders? Or is it fundamentally about the money? Let's look at how the presentation builds that case. Moving to Section 3, Economic and Resource Grievances. Let's follow the money. The historical economic pain points laid out here are pretty massive. The speaker accuses Ottawa of consistently stifling Western prosperity. This starts all the way back with the 1970s National Energy Program, which the presentation claims completely decimated the local economy. It also calls out supply management systems as basically cartels that restrict Western farmers. And on top of that, it argues that federal regulations have intentionally landlocked Alberta by constantly halting pipeline development. Then, we get to the macroeconomic figures, and they are staggering. $244.6 billion. That is Alberta's net federal contribution between 2007 and 2022. That's a mountain of money. And the presentation frames this as hard evidence that Alberta is heavily and disproportionately subsidizing the rest of the country. And then there's this number, $25.6 billion. The assertion here is that because Ottawa negotiates oil prices on the province's behalf, this federally negotiated price differential ends up costing Alberta $25.6 billion in lost oil revenue every single year. Next, the presentation takes direct aim at the federal equalization formula. The speaker breaks down the perceived unfairness like this. Alberta is actually required to pay into the system, even when the province is running a massive deficit. Meanwhile, structural exemptions allow a province like Quebec to just keep receiving equalization payments, even when they're posting a provincial surplus. You can really sense the intense frustration in the source material on this point. But how does this actually affect normal people? To connect these massive billions down to daily life, the speaker uses the example of a simple loaf of bread. 10 years ago, it was $3.50. Today, it's $4. The ingredients haven't changed, right? But inflation, which the source entirely blames on a federally created cost of living crisis and hidden taxes, has driven up prices, creating what she calls an absolute affordability disaster. So we've got imposed historical borders, severely skewed political maps, and billions of dollars draining away. The next logical question is, how do these deep economic and historical frustrations bleed over into modern social and justice concerns? That brings us to Section 4, Social and Justice Concerns, the headlines driving the alienation. Here, the argument shifts gears into some rapid-fire justice and crime statistics to suggest the whole country is just moving in an incredibly dangerous direction. The speaker references reports of a 700% increase in human trafficking in the Niagara region, rising numbers of non-Canadian inmates in federal prisons, polls showing that only 17% of citizens actually feel safe in their own neighborhoods, and the Supreme Court striking down mandatory minimum sentences for severe crimes. And this brings us to what is, without a doubt, the emotional peak of the entire source material. Combining that massive economic drain with all these social alarms, the speaker bluntly concludes, this is not a serious country anymore, and there's no reason that anybody should want to be a part of it. This right here is the major pivot point, going from simply listing off a bunch of grievances to issuing a definitive call to action. Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, the push for separation. The speaker's ultimate conclusion. Now, you might be thinking, well, why not just fix Canada from the inside? The speaker addresses this by laying out the incredibly steep constitutional hurdles you'd actually have to jump over. First, you have to literally open up the Constitution, then get agreement from 7 out of 10 provincial premiers, and ensure those provinces represent at least 50% of the population. The speaker admits that getting the eastern provinces to agree to just give up their built-in power is pretty much an impossible mountain for the West to climb. So the crucial takeaway the presentation finally lands on is this. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly like it's designed. The ultimate thesis is that because the system was intentionally built from day one to disadvantage the West and maintain Eastern dominance, separation isn't just an idea, it's the only logical and viable option left for Alberta to protect its own interests. So we've unpacked the historical roots, the structural math, the billions of dollars, and the social alarms. Why does any of this matter to you? Because whether you agree with this movement or think it's completely misguided, these underlying frictions are actively shaping national politics right now. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. As these deeply held historical grievances continue to collide with intense modern economic pressures, will the West find some way to reform Confederation against those steep odds? Or are we witnessing the inevitable fracturing of a nation? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning what's really behind the headlines.